We are all quite familiar with the idea of more modern amphibious assaults. This was made most famous in pop culture by the events of D-Day as depicted in the opening of the movie Saving Private Ryan. Its cinematic style was so genre-defining that virtually all other gritty war films after it have followed in its footsteps. This applies not just to films set in the Second World War, but has extended all the way into movies set in the distant past. Films like Troy, Robin Hood, and Vikings are all prime examples of this. I get why it's been done from Hollywood's perspective, but how much does it actually track to history? Did amphibious assaults even happen in the past? And if they did, should we imagine a D-Day-like scene with troops pouring out of triremes like their Higgins boats, splashing their way through the surf, and navigating their way through defensive fortifications, all while under murderous fire from arrows and catapults? Let's find out. This video was sponsored by Magellan TV. They're an awesome documentary streaming service run by filmmakers with a selection of over 3,000 videos to choose from among the categories of history, science, nature, space, and more. When it comes to history documentaries, Magellan TV has the richest and most varied content anywhere. Ancient, modern, current, war, biography, and even related genres like science and crime, which are historical in nature. If you like our content, I can highly recommend you check out the documentary series Warrior's Way, which traces the lives of famous warriors from childhood training to bloody battle. Magellan TV is compatible with Roku, Amazon Fire TV, Apple TV, Google Play, and iOS, which means you can watch it anytime, anywhere, on your television, laptop, or mobile device. Sign up today to get 30% off an annual membership, which starts with a 2-week free trial. That's less than $3.50 a month for access to thousands of documentaries. The offer is available for both new and returning users, so be sure to click the link in the description below or go to try.magellantv.com/invicta. Enjoy! To kick off this whole conversation, I wanted to start off by looking at the sorts of military capabilities we could expect on the side of someone attacking a coastline and someone defending it. On the assault side of things, we are necessarily talking about ancient warships. It's a subject which I absolutely adore and which I've previously discussed in a 3-part series which you can check out if you're interested. To summarize, what we should expect from this period are oared galleys. On the small end of things would be lembos, hemiola, and Lubirnian style ships with just a few dozen oars laid out in 1 or 2 rows and capable of transporting a handful of soldiers. A tier above this would be the famous Trireme, the workhorse of Mediterranean naval warfare. It was about 35 meters long, with around 170 oars divided into 3 banks per side. For its crew, it carried anywhere from a dozen marines to over 100 in some cases. As the centuries rolled on though, higher intensity conflicts at sea led to the development of increasingly large ships like the Quinquiremes and Hexaremes, which boasted yet more rowers and complements of over 100 soldiers as well as artillery. At the highest end would be the Polyreme monstrosities like the Tessera Contaries of Ptolemy IV, barely able to make it beyond the shores, but capable of transporting an estimated 2,800 marines and numerous artillery batteries. In addition to all of these combat vessels would be fast scout ships and lumbering troop transports. In theory, if you were to have them all converge upon a beach at one time, it very well might look like an ancient D-Day from afar. In fact, quite a striking comparison can actually be found in the historical record. Over 2,000 years before the landings at Normandy, the Romans mobilized roughly the same size force deployed by the Allies on D-Day to invade Africa during the First Punic War. Now in terms of naval defenses, these things were not as impressive. There was really no concept of heavily fortified stretches of coastline as was conducted by the Nazis in anticipation of the Allied invasion. The closest you might get would be some walls or strings of forts along strategic inland areas like the Roman frontier of the Rhine. Repeating the same sort of defenses along a vast shoreline would have been madness in an age where you really didn't expect much in the way of naval invasions. Perhaps the most you'd see over long distances would be a line of watchtowers to keep an eye out for incoming raiders. So really, in most places that a fleet would land, we should not expect a D-Day style reception on the part of the defenders. However, there was of course the exception when it came to cities and forts which lay along the shore. In this case, its inhabitants would often seek to reinforce their water-facing flanks. Even if they didn't necessarily expect an amphibious assault by ships, it was nonetheless prudent to ward off land-based forces that might otherwise wade through the water or attack at low tide. As such, many settlements and ports would have a perimeter wall and some towers that face the sea. In a pinch, these could be reinforced with ditches and stakes as needed. For the larger ports, there might have even been efforts made to close off naval access entirely using breakers or great chains. not quite up to par with Germany's Atlantic Wall fortifications, but enough to ward off all but the most dedicated of attackers from antiquity. With this theoretical understanding in place, let's now go ahead and take a look at some real historical examples of what happened when attacker and defender clashed in an amphibious setting. The first prime example will be the Battle of Marathon. It took place in 490 BC during the First Greco Persian War. The context is that a Persian army of some 20 to 60,000 soldiers aboard several hundred ships had been dispatched to exact retribution against the Eretrians and Athenians who had supported the Ionian revolt. The fleet island hopped across the Aegean, crushing all resistance along the way as they accepted the surrender of or otherwise stormed small communities. They landed in Euboea unopposed, ravaged the land, and sacked Eretria. The Persian force then re-embarked and made their way down towards Athens. But rather than sail their full force into the teeth of Port Piraeus, they instead chose to land a large contingent of their troops at the nearby Bay of Marathon, from which they could then march on Athens, while the remainder of the fleet rounded the peninsula for a pincer attack by sea. The initial objective was achieved, and the Persians made their amphibious landing unopposed, setting up camp on the wide, undefended coastal plain. However, the Athenians and some Plataeans had managed to advance upon the surrounding high ground and were setting up to bottle up the enemy at their beachhead. The standoff went on for several days, until some unknown inciting incident, perhaps the partial re-embarking of some Persian forces, seems to have caused the Greeks to attack. I'll now quote Herodotus. "The armies at this point were about a mile apart. When the Persians saw them come running, they prepared to receive them, seeing the charging Athenians as virtually suicidal. After all, their ranks were far thinner, and they lacked any cavalry or archers. Such was the imagination of the Persian army. But the Athenians, closing with the Persians, fought in admirable fashion. The battle at Marathon lasted for most of the day. The foreigners overcame the middle part of the line, against which the strongest of the Persian army was arrayed. Here, the foreigners prevailed and broke the Greeks, pursuing them inland. But the Athenians and Plataeans were victorious on both flanks. They allowed the routed foes to flee, and drew their wings together to fight against those that had broken the middle of their line. Here, the Athenians were again victorious, and followed after the Persians in their flight, cutting them down until they came to the sea. There, they called for fire, and seizing the ships, Callimachus the Polemarch died while fighting for the ships. There too died Stesilaus, son of Thrasylaus, another one of the Athenian generals. Moreover, Cneigerus, son of Euphorion, fell there, his hand smitten off by an axe as he laid hold of the ship's deck, and many other famous Athenians. 7 ships the Athenians thus won, with the rest the Persians pushed off from shore. From there they would sail around the shore to capture Athens, while the Greeks raced back on foot. Ultimately, the Athenians made it home first, and succeeded in warding off an attack. This battle is a great example of a conflict fought on the beaches. However, it's not really the sort of D-Day style amphibious assault we're looking for, as the landing itself was achieved uncontested on a wide open shore. It's really only after the fighting had already turned that both sides fought in the waves amongst the ships. This would really be emblematic of the rest of the Greco Persian Wars, where there was certainly a lot of forces moving around and attacking by boat, but never really into the jaws of a prepared defense. Let's therefore jump ahead to a later example, which will be more relevant to our studies. Our next pair of examples occur during the Peloponnesian War when Athens, Sparta, and their respective allies clashed. Generally speaking, the Athenians had the stronger navy, while the Spartans had the stronger army. This asymmetry resulted in a protracted war where neither could totally dominate the other, and where both sides were constantly looking for ways to undermine each other's advantageous position. For example, in 425 BC, the Spartan army marched off to invade and ravage the lands of Attica, while an Athenian fleet sailed around the Peloponnese to conduct operations along the enemy's rear. This meant opportunistically establishing a fortified garrison on the tiny promontory of Pylos before continuing on to Quinquireme. From here, the outpost would be a thorn in the enemy's side, raiding the surrounding region and fomenting revolt among the neighboring Messenians. This development so alarmed the Spartans that they recalled their whole invasion force. An army and fleet were then immediately dispatched to uproot the Athenian position. On the defense would be Demosthenes and his meager 5 triremes, which translated to just about 50 hoplites, a handful of archers, and a few hundred rowers who could be slightly armed. Luckily, a ship of Messenians arrived, boosting his troop numbers by 40 hoplites, for a total of 90. Against him, though, was an approaching Spartan army of several hundred and a fleet of 60 ships and all their marines. Luckily, he had the advantage of the terrain and the luxury of several days spent fortifying the position. As the Spartans approached, they landed forces on the neighboring island of Sphacteria, hoping to establish a chokehold on the bay before launching a pincer attack from both land and sea. Demosthenes, for his part, had split up his men. The bulk of them took up positions along the fortified route, while just 60 hoplites and a few archers were posted to guard their weaker position along the shore. As the enemy closed in, Demosthenes is said to have made a speech to these men, reminding them that though they were few in number, they held the advantage should they meet the enemy's assault right at the beach. I'll now quote the text recording this incident. "Soldiers and comrades in this adventure, I hope that none of you in our present strait will think to show his wit by exactly calculating all the perils that encompass us, but that you will rather hasten to close with the enemy without staying to count the odds, seeing in this your best chance of safety. As to the numbers of the enemy, these shouldn't worry you much. Large as they may be, he can only engage in small detachments. It's impossible to bring more. Besides, the numerical superiority that we have to meet is not that of an army on land with everything else equal, but of troops on board ship, upon an element where many favorable accidents are required to act with effect. I therefore consider that his difficulties may be fairly set against our numerical deficiencies, and at the same time I charge you, as Athenians who know by experience what landing from ships on a hostile territory means, and how impossible it is to drive back an enemy determined enough to stand his ground, and not to be frightened away by the surf and the terrors of the ship sailing in, to stand fast in this present emergency, beat back the enemies at the water's edge, and save yourselves in this place." In this, Demosthenes proved correct, as the amphibious assault of the Spartans had great difficulty in bringing their full force to bear against the beachhead. Captains were reluctant to run their ships upon the rocks, and thus were left to cheer on the men ahead and wait their turn to take a crack at the small beachhead. This incensed the Spartan captain Brasidas, who, quote, shouted out to them that they must never allow the enemy to fortify himself in their country for the sake of saving timber, but must break their vessels and force a landing, and bade the allies, instead of hesitating in such a moment, to sacrifice their ships for Sparta in return for her many benefits, to run them boldly aground, land in one way or another, and make themselves master of the place and its garrison. Not content with this exhortation, he forced his own steersman to run his ship ashore, and stepping onto the gangway, was endeavoring to land when he was cut down by the Athenians, and after receiving many wounds, fainted away. Falling into the bows, his shield slipped off his arm and into the sea, and being thrown ashore, was picked up by the Athenians, and afterwards used for the trophy which they set up after this attack. The rest also did their best, but were not able to land, owing to the difficulty of the ground and the unflinching tenacity of the Athenians. For the remainder of the day, wave upon wave of Spartans crashed upon the fortifications, but to no success. The attackers thus resolved on establishing a proper siege of the position. Unfortunately for them, the Athenian fleet in the region now arrived to save their comrades, turning the tide on the Peloponnesians. They defeated the Spartan fleet and trapped some 400 enemy soldiers on the island of Sphacteria. 120 of these were full Spartiates, which represented an estimated 10% of their overall citizen body at the time. This caused a panic in Sparta and set off a flurry of diplomatic negotiations between the two enemies. However, when peace talks failed, the Athenians tightened their stranglehold on the island, expecting its trapped inhabitants to starve out within a few days. However, the Spartans put out rewards for any volunteers who could sneak supplies onto the island. Thus at night, there were to be many small vessels, swimmers, and divers who infiltrated the blockade to keep the garrison alive. Ultimately, this led the Athenians to commit to an all-out assault with 3,000 soldiers and many more lightly armed rowers. The amphibious assault began just before dawn as a picked group of 800 heavy infantry led by Demosthenes hit the beaches on both sides of the island. They quickly disembarked, splashing down and running up the sand to silence a few dozen Spartans just barely waking up in their outposts. Right at dawn came the remainder of the Athenians, who disgorged hundreds of more hoplites and thousands of light infantry including archers and slingers. Our sources describe the scene as follows. Quote, "The tactics of Demosthenes had divided them into companies of 200, more or less, and made them occupy the highest points in order to paralyze the enemy by surrounding him on every side and thus leaving him without any tangible adversary, exposed to the crossfire of their host, plied by those in the rear if he attacked in front, and if by those on one flank, he moved against those on the other. In short, wherever he went, he would have the assailants behind him, and these light-armed assailants the most awkward of all, arrows, darts, stones, and slings, making them formidable at a distance, and there being no means of getting at them at close quarters, as they could conquer flying, and the moment their pursuers turned, they were upon him. Such was the idea that inspired Demosthenes in his conception of the descent, and presided over its execution. The amphibious assault, carried out in this surprisingly modern-sounding manner, proved absolutely devastating. The Spartan force was cut to pieces, and ultimately surrendered en masse when terms were offered. This shocked the Greek world, and changed the nature of the war moving forwards. In the years ahead, there would be many more clashes between forces along the shores of the Aegean and the Mediterranean, but none quite as captivating as the ones we've just discussed. Still, it'll be worth mentioning a few. The Siege of Tyre by Alexander the Great in 332 BC is one such example where amphibious assaults involving siege equipment were used to storm the walls of the island city. I'll now quote a bit from Arrian to give you a taste of the action. When Alexander's ships approached the city and the gangways were thrown onto the wall from their decks, the shield bearers used them to climb boldly onto the wall. Admetos proved a brave man on that occasion, and Alexander too went in with them, taking an energetic part in the action and bearing witness to any glorious exploits undertaken in the heat of the action. Admetos mounted the wall first, and as he cheered his men onward, he was struck with a spear and died on the spot. Coming up after him, Alexander and the companions took the wall. When some of the towers and their curtain walls were under his control, Alexander proceeded across the battlements to the palace. The slaughter was great. It's quite the heavy action, but admittedly, this final amphibious assault ends up playing out more like a traditional siege than what we had seen previously at Marathon, Pylos, and Sphacteria. Looking through the rest of Alexander's campaigns, one will find him engaged in yet more sieges of this sort across the lands. While we do often see men trudging across the waters into the teeth of the enemy, these instances are all cases of contested river crossings, so not really in the vein of the D-Day style assaults we're looking to explore. For this sort of engagement, we'll have to skip ahead once more, several hundred years, to the campaigns of Julius Caesar. In 55 BC, we will find the general leading an expedition across the English Channel to Britain. It's pretty much as close to D-Day geographically as one can hope to get. He advanced with at least 100 ships, carrying 2 legions, and made way for the natural harbor of Dover. However, when Caesar beheld the steep heights along the shore and the large host of the enemy atop the surrounding cliffs, he chose instead to move up the coast and land at another spot. Unfortunately, the enemy was able to shadow his moves and contested this landing. I'll now read directly from the commentaries. Quote, "This was for many reasons an operation of much difficulty. The ships, on account of their size, could not be run ashore, except in deep water. The troops, though they did not know the ground, had their arms free, and were loaded with the great and grievous weight of their arms, had nevertheless at one and the same time to leap down from the vessels, to stand firm in the waves, and to fight the enemy. The enemy, on the other hand, had all their limbs free, and knew the ground exceedingly well, and either standing on dry land, or advancing a little way into the water, they boldly hurled their missiles, or spurred on their horses, which were trained to it. Frightened by all this, and wholly inexperienced in this sort of fighting, our troops did not press on with the same fire and force as they were accustomed to show in land engagements. When Caesar remarked this, he commanded the ships of war to remove themselves a little from the transports, to row at speed, and to bring up on the exposed flank of the enemy, and thence to drive and clear them off with slings, arrows, and artillery. This movement proved of great service to our troops, for the natives, frightened by the shape of the ships, the motion of the oars, and the unfamiliar type of artillery, came to a halt and retired, but only for a little space. And then, while our troops still hung back, chiefly on account of the depth of the sea, the eagle-bearer of the 10th Legion, after prayer to heaven to bless the legion by his act, cried out, quote, "Leap down, soldiers, unless you wish to betray your eagle to the enemy. It shall be told that I, at any rate, did my duty to my country and my general." When he had said this with a loud voice, he cast himself forth from the ship and began to bear the eagle against the enemy. Then our troops exhorted one another not to allow so dire a disgrace, and leapt down from the ship with one accord. And when the troops on the nearest ship saw them, they likewise followed on, and drew near to the enemy. The fighting was fierce on both sides. Our troops, however, because they could not keep rank, nor stand firm, nor follow their proper standards, for any man from any ship attached himself to whatever standard he chanced upon, were in considerable disorder. But the enemy knew all the shallows, and as soon as they had observed from the shore a party of soldiers disembarking one by one from a ship, they spurred on their horses and attacked them while they were in difficulties, many surrounding the few, while others hurled missiles into a whole party from the exposed flank. Caesar noticed this, and causing the boats of the warships and likewise the scout vessels to be manned with soldiers, he sent them to support any parties whom he had observed to be in distress. The moment our men stood firm on dry land, they charged with all the comrades close behind and put the enemy to rout, but they could not pursue very far because the cavalry had not been able to hold on their course and make the island. In this single respect, Caesar's proverbial good fortune had failed him. Soon after this clash, the Britons pulled back inland, leaving the Romans to establish a camp by their beachhead. There would be fighting and negotiations in the days ahead, but Caesar would leave the island shortly thereafter to winter in Gaul. The following year, though, he would return in force with another invasion fleet. This one featured hundreds of ships and a full 5 legions. Seeing this, the Britons abandoned any defense of the coast, choosing instead to find better positions in the interior. The landing was therefore concluded unopposed. Later, we get another taste of Caesar's naval assaults when he launched an attack on Pharos Island during the Alexandrine War in 47 BC. His own men had been bottled up in a portion of the city for several months, clashing with Egyptian forces along the city streets and its harbors. The island was seen as a key area of strategic control. Caesar therefore endeavored to take it, boarding roughly 5,000 legionaries and several hundred light troops onto a ragtag fleet of boats and skiffs. These concentrated their assault on the north side of the island. I'll now quote the commentaries again. At first the enemy held out against our attack and were a match for us, as they were able to fight from the roofs of buildings and defend the shores in full armor at the same time, while our men had difficulty in gaining access to the coast because of the rough terrain. In addition, the enemy protected the narrow channels with adept and clever maneuvers in skiffs and 5 warships. But when the layout of the shore became clear and our men tried out the shallows, a few of them took a chance on the shore and others followed them. They then kept making charges against the enemy who were arrayed against them on the flat part of the beach, and now the whole force from Pharos turned and ran. At this point, Roman vessels armed with yet more men and artillery now forced the issue on the causeway linking the island to Alexandria. The enemy responded in kind with their own ships, and both sides now poured out forces onto the narrow battlefield. The rain of missiles, though, and the tenacious charge of the attackers began to overwhelm the Romans, who panicked and attempted to abandon the position. In the chaos, many of their boats were swarmed by men and sank. Hundreds of legionaries were killed, and Caesar only managed to escape by diving out into the waters of the harbor. Looking at the rest of antiquity, there's certainly more naval action to be had. Events of the Sicilian expedition, Regulus's invasion of Africa, and the siege of Carthage, let alone the countless other attacks on ports and seaside communities, could occupy us for days should we decide to review them all. For the purposes of this video though, we'll stop here, as I think we've given you a sufficient introduction into the world of ancient amphibious assaults. As you can see, they were fairly common and could be quite cinematic. However, just as today, not every assault by sea was a D-Day style affair on Omaha Beach, and in fact, we have many more examples of unopposed landings than we do of heavily contested ones. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode on an often overlooked subject. I also wanted to thank our patrons for continuously funding the channel, and to the researchers, writers, and artists who made this episode possible. Be sure to like and subscribe for more content, and check out these related videos. See you in the next one.